Almost 75 years ago, the tricolor set aloft on the sky above Red Fort for the first time. This marked the completion of a crusade that the people of the country had set out on more than a century ago. We had achieved independence from foreign rule, but not one but two countries came into existence at that midnight. Here, we will try to study the legacy and the indelible memories, both ecstatic and dreadful, that it left behind. To understand partition, we have to first understand what constitutes a nation. Is it a common language, culture, religion, or a shared history? A nation is the living embodiment of the people that live in it. It is galvanized by a common desire to live together. It was the absence of this mutual feeling of togetherness or unity between the two main religious communities that led to the severance of the country into two parts. Sir Iqbal, the famous poet of Sare Jahan Se Acha, declared that Muslims cannot live under a different majority, as their religion is woven into their social construct and the two cannot be separated. This declaration did not find many takers at first, but he persisted with it, and 2 decades later he presented it as his presidential address to the Muslim League. It was formally adopted as a resolution by the League in 1940 and came to be known as the two-nation theory.
Congress was gradually losing support to the Muslims during this period for not upholding its pre-poll promises, but it refused to recognize the League as the official voice of the Muslims to consolidate its political power. With Nehru having rejected the Cabinet Mission's first plan of 1946, as he felt that the grouping of Muslim and Hindu blocs would leave the centre to be weak, Jinnah called for Direct Action Day, and throngs of armed mobs took to the streets, which saw riots all across the country, with the epicenters of violence being at Kolkata, Lahore, and Amritsar. On the other hand, Sardar Patel wanted to make a pragmatic rather than an emotional decision and accepted partition as he felt communal tensions would only further increase. Gandhi was apprehensive of this decision to partition and had always fought for an united India, but had also come to accept this demand as the threat of further violence was imminent.
The idea of partition was not new. Several plans under the British merged Punjab, Sindh, and NFWP, and Bengal was partitioned into two in 1905. But when riots broke out in Bengal and the British yielded, the partition was reversed in 1911. The partition was supposed to see the creation of three entities: India, Pakistan, and East Bengal. But rioting all around the countries on a scale hitherto unseen, and chilling tales of the extent of people had to go are still fresh in the memories of many. It was the largest unplanned migration in human history, and saw 200,000 to 2 million dead and about 20 million displaced. Thousands of women were abducted on both sides and were made to convert to the religion of the abductor and were forced into marriage, or they were killed by their family members to preserve family honor. Nobody foresaw the destruction it left in its wake. The two newly created countries who were one just days ago were at war, and this conflict has manifested itself in many ways. The map of Delhi highlights this fact. Most of West Delhi is made up of refugee colonies for people who had to flee for their lives and had nothing or no one to call their own. Everything lost all for the cause. All this added to the plight of a newly independent nation at war just a few days into its existence, now facing a refugee crisis with a strained economy and blocked trade routes.
The inequitable distribution of resources had also been a contentious issue for decades. When the dust settled, India was left with 82% of the earlier population, but only with 77% of land. Its losses were compounded by the loss of high potential oil producing sources in the Indus Valley and East Bengal, salt and gypsum of the Salt Range, low grade coal in West Punjab, Sindh, and Balochistan, although they weren't significant. India also faced the problem of feeding its population. In the agricultural sector, 84% of the net sown area came to India's share, while the remaining 16% went to Pakistan. Although Pakistan got slightly less than what her share of population would demand, she made up for it with way better irrigation facilities. The partition therefore reduced India to greater dependence on the vagaries of rainfall, and that accounts for the yearly fluctuations in her agricultural production. Even before independence, India was deficit in food grains. This deficiency was now aggravated. She produced only 68 and 65% of her total yield of rice and wheat crops respectively. while Pakistan, on the other hand, was always in surplus. India, after the partition, adopted a Soviet type of governing and tried to divert their agricultural output into industrial input, and hand in hand, this would lead to the flourishing of the nation. But on one hand, it became difficult to feed the population, so they couldn't starve people and continue with their development. So, this was a major setback to the growth of the country as a whole. Partition had a major impact on trade. Commodities like raw jute and cotton from countries like Afghanistan, Persia, and Iraq, which undivided India used to export, now became a major imports, exported through Indian ports. There was thus a flourishing cent report trade, which was eliminated on the account of the refusal of Pakistan to allow transit facilities. But the more serious effect was to hamper India's export capacity. In short, the partition, by reducing India's export capacity and by increasing her import requirements, aggravated the post war problems of deficits in India's balance of payments. Before the partition, banking was conducted mainly by the Hindus, even in the Muslim majority areas of the country. Anticipating disturbances, most of the banks in Punjab transferred their head office to safer areas of East Punjab and Delhi. Therefore, when disturbances actually broke out, most of the banks suffered considerable losses and some had to close down offices there.
The partition had impacted almost every single aspect of our lives, and it continues to play a significant role in the current Indian politics as well. The conflict in Kashmir seems to be an unresolvable issue ever since the partition occurred. The conflict began in 1947 when Maharaja Hari Singh decided to let Kashmir remain independent as there was a Muslim majority population and a Hindu monarch. As internal rebellion rose, the Maharaja as well as Sheikh Abdullah and Syed Mir Qasim endorsed Indian accession, and after the 1947 Indo-Pakistan War, UN Security Council mediation was called upon but was of no major consequence. Gradually, with another Indo-Pakistan War over Kashmir in 1965, Kashmiri separatism began to grow in the 1970s and 80s. With the rigged elections of 1987 and the rise of radical Islam, terrorism, populism, and the Kashmiri Pandit exodus in 1990, tensions had further escalated. Then the war, which was never officially declared by the Pakistani government in 1999, to the current situation which saw months of internet shutdowns, curfews, and the separation of Kashmir into two union territories in 2019 with the abolishment of Article 370, seems to point to no clear direction towards which Kashmir is heading.
Pakistan's mismanagement of resources from East Bengal and mistreatment of ethnic minorities also brought India on the verge of another war with Pakistan in 1971, which led to the independence of East Pakistan and formation of Bengal. The state of ethnic minorities in countries that once used to be a part of India also led to the controversial CAA of 2019. Mahatma Gandhi once quoted, "If I am to die by the bullet of a madman, I must do so smiling. God must be in my heart and on my lips, and if anything happens, you are not to shed a single tear."